Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books on Tap Live, Publishers Weekly's fun, booky, talky, occasionally drinky show. Today, we're talking to Matthew Medney, who is the author with John Connolly of Beyond. Oh, God, I didn't ask you how to pronounce this. Matt, help me out.
Kuiper.
Thank you. Beyond Kuiper, the Galactic Star Alliance. This is Matt, so everybody say hello to Matt, everyone. I said everyone twice. This event is sponsored by Heavy Metal. We're giving away signed copies of the book, along with several subscriptions to Heavy Metal magazine, which, if you haven't heard of it, we are going to be talking a lot about. Enter to win by going to publishersweekly.com/Medney. That's MEDNEY. We've also dropped a handy link into the page in the comments section on Facebook and YouTube. So if you don't want to try to spell publishersweekly.com/Medney, we did it for you. During the event, you, the audience members, can ask questions by writing them in the comments section on Facebook or YouTube. And we'll try to answer as many as possible after the interview. Frankly, I have learned that your questions are better than mine. So usually I just kind of put them in a little early. If you'd like to receive notifications for future Books on Tap live events, sign up at publishersweekly.com/booksontap-live. And that is my spiel. Matthew or Matt, which do you prefer?
We can go with Matt today.
All right, Matt, welcome to Books on Tap. Thank you for sipping a little red wine with me. Tell me yours is red. Ah, there it is. What are you drinking?
It is a 2016 Bordeaux.
Very nice. I have some sort of Argentine blend that is not as old as 2016, but I do
love them all back though.
Oh yeah, I think this is a Mendoza. I think it's kind of all over the place. But I'm not going to look at the back of the bottle. I'm going to look at the back of your book instead, as I put this back up for everyone to see a very cool, fancy, pretty cover. Matt, let's talk about this book.
Cool.
So. First of all, why don't you just give us kind of the backstory? What's this book about? When did you start writing it? When did the idea come to you? Just, the general, the basics.
So I co-wrote this book with one of my best friends, John Connolly, who is an aerospace engineer by day. So as much as he would have loved to be on this with me, he is literally building rocket ships at Lockheed Martin while this is going on. He may or may not have this on in the background. So if he does, John, love you. But John and I have been best friends since 2010. And this book goes back to 2015, where we had a simple notion where we thought, what if life in the universe was alive and well, but they just didn't care to talk to us because we weren't far enough along on the Kardashian scale, or if, we just weren't interesting. And from that idea, we birthed the concept of Beyond Kuiper, where the Kuiper belt, which is real and in our solar system, is a ring of asteroids that is at the far end of Neptune, where Pluto lies, which is why, for science nerds, Pluto's not a planet anymore, because it is in the gravitational pull of the Kuiper belt, not of the sun. And we said, what if the Kuiper belt wasn't a ring of asteroids that encompasses our solar system to ward off protoplanets and other interstellar objects, but instead was a military installation by the Galactic Star Alliance used to quarantine solar systems that were too hostile to interact with the rest of the galaxy. And that was the impetus for the whole book. From there, we built out the GSA, the Galactic Star Alliance, and there's 600,000 worlds. And transversely, we built the Earth in the year 2092. And I know we're going to talk about the hard science of the book, but the reason we picked 2092 is because as the book progresses, there'll be a voyage, and we wanted to hold true to when the planetary alignments would happen so that we could actually fly by specific planets in the year that they would actually be aligned. So John did some very clever math and some projecting of the orbital trajectory of every planet in our solar system, and we landed on the year 2092 as our start point, because that's when the planets would start aligning during our voyage later in the book.
I am really glad that my partner, who used to work for NASA, isn't watching this, because I just butchered a real life science thing that takes place in space. I'm just like, whoo, thank God she is at work right now. 2092 is a really interesting year, and I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about dates and what it means to try to project scientific discoveries and developments by a certain date. And I think for a lot of the folks in the audience, probably one of the most famous dates in science fiction you will ever think of is 2001. 2001: A Space Odyssey being like one of the most important science fiction novels and science fiction movies of all time. If you go back and watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, we're not there yet.
So we're not even at the Jetsons yet.
So sorry, it was 2082 or 2092?
2092.
2092. So we're in 2092. How did you, a writer, and John, a science guru, he's an engineer, right? He's an aerospace engineer?
Aerospace engineer, yeah. So he actually has 4 satellites that he's designed in orbit right now.
Holy cow. So how did the two of you figure out what science might maybe kind of look like in 2092 while also acknowledging that you were really trying to get the planets aligned, so you probably weren't also going to get the robots aligned? How did that all work?
So I would actually argue we have, and that's why we started writing this book in 2015, and it's literally taken us 5 years, not to write the actual book, but to do the research and to keep it as plausible as possible. And John has done countless hours of research and reading of different journals and scientific theories. And I mean, even our spaceship's speed is quantifiable to a 70-year progression of where we are today. It doesn't go at light speed. There isn't any Earth technology that couldn't progress conservatively over the next 7 decades. But some of the biggest pieces of it is that in the year 2044, the U.S. starts moving away from crude oil. And if you look at the back of the book, there's timelines that we've put in that shows the progression of how everything happened. And California specifically goes fully electric in the year 2044. We wrote that in 2015, 2016. And then just 2 months ago, California announced that they won't be selling any fuel-based cars after the year 2035. So that's actually pretty on point with the timeline that we theorized. With that, John started looking through propulsion technology in different ways that with some minor breakthroughs, the elevation of how we can, create engines and speeds and technology that can propel us through the vacuum of space. And through that research, the year 2092 actually felt pretty on point. There is a third world war that happens in the 2050s that moves us into a one world government that also, in theory, helps a little bit. We have bases on Mars that start in the 30s, which is in par with what Elon Musk and SpaceX are looking to do in the next 5 years. So we actually did, work through the science, the theories, and obviously there's a lot of hypotheses and different assumptions made to get us to the year 2092, but every piece of assumption was based in empirical fact that got us those conclusions. And it took us a pretty sizable amount of time to finalize on different points that would keep the book as true to science as possible. And we always kind of joke that when we started the book and we started accepting it, the movie Gravity came out and the scientific community butchered the science of it. And John being a scientist and an aerospace engineer, and I being a true hard science fiction nerd, vowed that we would make sure that the book that we write, if nothing else, would adhere to as much empirical science as humanly possible.
So talk to me a little bit about your models. There's all kinds of different science fiction, and I'm gonna make the safe guess that most of the people tuning in here probably know the difference. But why don't you talk a little bit about what hard science fiction means and the kinds of great works of hard science fiction that you and John turned to for inspiration? If John were here, I would ask him about works of science as well. But if you have any off the top of your head that you know are important to him, I think people would love to hear about
Dune.
that too.
He starts and stops with Dune as his inspiration for all things science fiction. For me, it really goes back to, some more fantastical stuff like H.P. Lovecraft and some harder science fiction stuff from Gene Roddenberry. And I always give the example of, in the original Star Trek, Kirk has to mediate the left, white, right, black-faced people with the left, black, right, white-faced people. And that episode came out during the civil rights movement in the 60s. And it was a moment to me that I always think about as how science fiction could be a lens for the communities at large to understand trials and tribulations and hardships that are happening in our real world through the escapism of fiction, but using that fiction as a vehicle to teach lessons. And while Roddenberry did that, he also used real scientific theories and terms. I mean, tachyons are totally hypothetical, but that is the hypothetical way in which time travel could work. It's not proven, but that is the scientific theory. And he uses stuff like that throughout Star Trek. And the litany of different terms and concepts that Star Trek uses is in a sense hard fiction. Star Wars, on the other hand, would be more of a fantastical science fiction where the lightsabers are not grounded in any sort of real science, but it is really fun and a lot of excitement with those battles. And that is something more of a soft science fiction.
For those of you at home who are big Star Trek nerds, we are referring to the episode Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Fun fact, Frank Gorshin, who played the Riddler on the live-action Batman, was the guest star for that episode.
You're right.
I'm a big Star Trek fan, so you got the right interview today, my friend.
Oh, I love
although
it.
I still couldn't pronounce Kuiper, so I'm not sure if that's true. Another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, although we could nerd out about science fiction all day, I love talking about the transition, from early hard science fiction to late hard science fiction. One of my favorite things to do is to troll my science fiction friends who've never read Alfred Bester and say, "What do you mean Gibson created cyberpunk? I'm sorry?" We could do that all day. Instead of doing that all day, what I actually want to talk to you about is your other project, which is heavy metal. So you started this project and heavy metal over the past decade. And heavy metal has an interesting history. Why don't you talk to us, sell us on heavy metal. Tell us what the magazine is. Tell us how you got here. Give us that part of your story.
So the image that everyone's seeing now is actually from my graphic novel that runs in Heavy Metal magazine called Darkwing. That's Captain Benedict Gunn. And heavy metal as a whole is, in my opinion, the perennial science fiction, fantasy, and horror publication. It's been around since 1977. We had the feature film Heavy Metal in 1981 that from that movie birthed Blade Runner and Fifth Element and Tarna, who's our main flagship character. And these theories or stories that were in the movie that a lot of people saw resonated in the magazine, which has been on shelves every year, at least once a year since 1977, which is unbelievable and incredible. And it's seen artists such as Mobius, who's worked on most of the Star Wars and most of the setscapes that everybody loves from Mad Max and Blade Runner and all of these other perennial science fiction movies. Heavy metal is the cornerstone of all things science fiction from a literary point of view. If you ask anyone from Guillermo del Toro to Sam Rockwell to Chris Columbus, all of these people were inspired by heavy metal. I actually interviewed Chris Columbus and his son Brendan, who's one of our authors, who writes a story called Savage Circus for Heavy Metal 303. And he talks about how heavy metal was an inspiration to him. The art that we see now is Moonlake, which is a graphic novel series written by Dan Fogler from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Walking Dead, all of these awesome genre movies. And Dan is an amazing human being and creative, and his creativity is exemplified in this anthology-esque type graphic novel series called Moonlake. The next piece of art that you were showing is Sun Eater. That's our werewolf Garm, created by Dylan Sprouse, who, if you all remember from his early days in Sweet Life of Zack and Cody and Big Daddy, and his brother Cole is on Riverdale, and Dylan exemplifies heavy metal and going your own path and doing the creative endeavors that you really want to do. I mean, after all of that success on film, he went and opened a meadery because he is so into North Valhallian culture that he wanted to own a meadery, and it's in Brooklyn. Actually, you could go there. We'll talk about it after. Really cool. He is the brewmaster and brews all of the mead himself. It is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And
is
this
that All Wise?
Yes.
Is that All Wise?
It's All Wise. Yes.
That place is great.
Yeah,
amazing. That's crazy.
Yeah, so great. And Garm that you see here is our main protagonist of this story called Sun Eater that is running as a comic book series in conjunction with the magazine, and we're excited for where that's going to lead us. So the magazine is, an epicenter for all things science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And, in partnership with my partner, David Irwin, who's our chief creative overlord, because you can't have an officer at heavy metal, you must have overlords, just to be clear. David comes from an amazing history at DC Entertainment and Hasbro with Transformers and building brands of these, genre-loving characters. And David has taken Garm and Tarna, who I know you have some art of as well, and Moonlake, and we have George C. Romero's The Rise, and we're curating this community of new titles and new characters and old characters to, put our flag in the ground that if you want, superheroes, go to Marvel and DC. But if you want really great science fiction, fantasy, or horror, that's heavy metal. It's always been heavy metal. We're here to come back and re-educate everyone as to how we started, why people cared, and why you should care today.
I'm sold. I mean, although I already kind of was. So tell me about. So heavy metal is obviously very heavily illustrated. Why do you and John decide to go with a novel series and not a graphic novel series? And talk to me a little bit about, if I'm correct, this is your debut, right? This is your debut novel. So talk to me about what it was like collaborating on a debut novel, and like a little about how you and John worked together.
So as I had said, we had started writing this book in 2015, and I had taken over heavy metal just under 2 years ago at this point. And so it was already decided that we wanted to write a novel. And coincidentally, it was already decided that we wanted to not only write a novel, but we want it to be an illustrated novel. So the book has 40 pieces of illustrations throughout it as chapter titles and planets and different systems in the back of the book. So it's kind of fortuitous that heavy metal and I, crossed paths, because it was already the type of novel that heavy metal would publish. And, creating it, ironically, John lives in Denver, where Lockheed is. And we wrote the entire book in Google Docs. It was unbelievable.
I really like this picture of Denver, by the way. Really elegant. Never seen a city in that light before.
So that's no, I love it. That's the planet of Majorn. And Majorn is the Sector 1 capital. The Galactic Star Alliance is their government is broken up into two bodies: the Council of Worlds and the Assembly of Planets. And every Council of World member is designated to a sector. There's 9 council members per sector. and there's 9 sectors, so 171 sector leaders. And then Assembly of Planets is a little bit more complicated, but there's 3,612 Assembly of Planet members. And this planet is one of the original founding planets of the GSA. There's 9 founding worlds that created this 600,000 world infrastructure that's been around for 11 million terms.
I was just about to pick up the book to see if I could find which alien race was in it, but now I'm back on the camera, so I can't do that anymore.
But I think the other part of your question was what it was like as a first-time writer, and
yes.
full transparency on this. John and I created this world, and we're really excited about it. And back in 2015, we didn't necessarily have the confidence that we could write the book, because the world was so vast and we'd created all of these environments that we really wanted to do justice to. So we actually talked to a lot of other writers to see if they wanted to come in and write the book based on our world. And after we talked to a handful, we didn't really jive with anyone's direction. And as we were trying to figure out how and what we were going to do with this property, John sent me the Carl Sagan pale blue dot quote. Consider again that dot, that's here, that's home, that's us. And that quote, sparked a piece of inspiration in my head, and we started writing, and it just kind of clicked from that moment, which is, again, very fortuitous because of how incredible of a science communicator Carl Sagan was. I mean, he paved the road for everything that any hard science fiction, any science guru, anyone that is in that sphere of content or exploration or discovery or creativity or curiosity, it all comes back to Carl Sagan. It all comes back to his ability to translate complex concepts into palatable, everyday people, digestible content. And that moment when John and I were bouncing back and forth on that passage was August 1st, 2016. And that's when I was like, we're just going to write this. And I'll never forget that conversation.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Sagan, because one of the really interesting things about Sagan is that in addition to being, an extremely important agent of science and the knowledge of science and scientists in the past, 50 years, he was also a pretty remarkable humanist. And one of the things that was interesting about him and his humanism was how educated he was beyond simply science. And with that, I wanted to kind of turn a little bit to talk about your politics. Well, not your politics, but your book's politics and the history of the book's politics. As with any science fiction novel, world building is very big here. Not just on our world, but on multiple other worlds, and with regards to the relations of our world and those multiple other worlds. That involves a really, you needed to write 60 years of history, 70 years of history, 72 years of history on our own planet based on your projections of the future and your understanding of our progression in the past. In addition, you needed to invent a politics of the galaxy wholesale. Tell me a little bit how the two of you went about doing that.
So the intergalactic politics, we actually went 100 million years into the past to really make sure that we covered what would be more than a cosmic second in terms of time. With the galactic politics and the GSA, we try to create something that we felt was as close to a perfect government system based on what we thought was lacking from a bipartisan point of view in our politics. And that's how we crafted the intergalactic politics. I mean, if you look at the book, on the first pages, there's a image that's called the Tauta, and that stands for the Accords of the Alliance. And those are the 13 tenets, or the 13 Bill of Rights of the Galactic Star Alliance. And that's what really took us, a long time to craft and to refine and to ensure we were covering all, beings' rights and the different ways in which beings from different planets, from different societies, from different origins should interact with each other. And then going back to Earth, it was there's key catalyst moments that need to happen when developing a world. In our case, it's the sentient ship of AI. When have we created a totally sentient AI? That was one that happens in, I believe, the years 2044 by a industry called RNA Industries. Another one is, how do we unify the planet? Past countries, past issues, and to us, that was, it needs to collapse. It needs to collapse and be rebuilt, and that was World War III. So those two tenets were kind of what we used as our guiding principles to then figure out how things would lead up to those moments and what fallout would happen after they happened.
I can't even imagine trying to plan out and understand. I mean, politics in our own world is difficult enough to understand. Trying to make sense of our democratic republic on an intergalactic level, I feel like I would need more than one glass of wine for it, I'll be honest. But then again, you probably did too.
We had many glasses of wine, many WeWork whiteboards, and a lot of erasers. I mean, that was, so to your point, the only part of the creation process where we were at a roadblock and couldn't do it over the phone and FaceTimes and Google Hangouts was constructing the Galactic Government. So John actually flew to LA from Denver, and we locked ourselves in a room for a weekend and figured out all of the intricacies of how it would work. Because, it's really easy to figure out the utopian side construct. Everything goes right. Everything is working. That's relatively easy. The problem is, what are the fail-safes that you are going to put into the doctrines, and what are the levers that you need to create for plausible situations that may happen? A planet deciding to go rogue from their accord with the rest of the alliance. How are they handled? Are they exterminated? Are they quarantined? They know the rest of the galaxy exists. So how do you fix that in a humane way? Or is the concept of doing something humane so human that, the eradication of a species that disobeys law and puts hundreds of thousands of planets at risk, exterminating them might be the most humane thing. And toggling with those concepts and finding a middle ground that felt not only plausible, but felt very in tune with what we would hope an alien species of that intellect and that vastness of, development would actually create. And, to your point, it's not simple. You have to think about all of these, horrible situations, and then how would a society that's endured for 11 million turns, and I say turns because our galaxy, thanks to John, has its own metric system called the Galactic Standard. A turn is a year, and they are very they're based off powers of 10, which is how most of our systems should be based on. We won't get into Fahrenheit and Celsius and all that fun stuff, but powers of 10 makes a lot of sense. So that's how our Galactic Standard units of measure is crafted. So, a society that's lived on for 11 million, years, turns, whatever terminology you want to use, has endured for a while. I mean, we as a society are in current society with technology, less than 200 years, 300 years tops. So a society that's been intergalactic for that long has to have some level of empathy and some ability to take really difficult situations and come to a reasonable, non-combative solution, or it would have blown up eons ago.
A reasonable non-combative solution sounds really nice. You should send your suggestions for how to do that to Congress, maybe in this font. I wonder if they would listen. Personally, if I got any email in that typeface, I would be like, all right, let's go. So we're gonna move to audience questions at this point, because they are frankly a lot more interesting than mine. And I'm gonna ask a two-parter, which is kind of a doozy. So let's start with Laura asks, how do you plan out a 10-book series? Which is a very good question. And I'm going to add to that Danita's question, which is, are you mentally ready to devote probably 10 years of your life to such a lengthy series? Will we see a Patrick Rothfuss situation here? Have fun with those questions.
So it's actually a 15-year plan. So and
Noted.
yes, we're very dedicated. The books are going to be released once every 18 months. We're already more than 2/3 of the way done with book 2. We have all 10 books outlined, pretty detailed. And 10 books sounds like a lot, but for the amount of hard science in the books, we felt that every volume, which is really every arc, should be no more than 350, 400 pages tops. So it's really 5 parts and 10 books. So each volume has 2 parts to it. So, the first full arc is volume 1, which is Beyond Kuiper, the Galactic Star Alliance, and Beyond Kuiper, the Voyage of the Nomad, which comes out next. And we separated them that way because these books are a lot more than just writings. There's amazing illustrated art, as we've talked about, and you've shown on the screen, which is created by our incredible artist, UT. UT is based in Turkey. We've actually never spoken to each other verbally because he doesn't speak English, and we do everything over Skype. And all of this art is created through briefs and sketches and Google Translate. Like, this book doesn't get created without the technology we've created already, which is so cool, right? It's a technological book about our future that could have only been created by the amount of incredible technology that we take for granted today, right? Like, imagine 50 years ago telling Isaac Asimov that he could have art in his book created by somebody on the other side of the planet that he can't speak the same language of. He would tell you that is insane science fiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the ability for us to have created this book is science fiction in and of itself, depending on what period of time you lived in. So that was really cool. Yes, I grew up in love with Harry Potter. I think J.K. Rowling is nothing short of a genius. And she wrote a 7-book series where she wrote the last chapter of book 7 first and really understood how the books were going to play out. So when we started the concept in the world for Beyond Kuiper, we wanted to take that same initiative, which is we want to know how the book's going to end and how the series will end so that we can put the right Easter eggs in, create the right moments throughout the book. So it is a extremely lengthy process that both Tony, who's John's life partner, and Alexis, who's my fiance, have given incredible amounts of support to, because we spend a lot of time on FaceTime and a lot of time in our writing rooms working and not spending time with them to get these done. But that's what a great partner in life does, is they see when something is important and they help build it up rather than move you away from it. So I think that answers both of those questions.
And tells viewers that they shouldn't be flirting with you in the DMs. So Michael asks a good question, specifically because I'm just gonna ask you, why an alliance of worlds as opposed to competing polities? And I love that he used the word polities here. So real government major nerd stuff right there.
I appreciate the word choice. I would say it's as simple as, if there were competing government colonies and all of these different forces coming at each other, it wouldn't have endured for 11 million years. The fact that there is an alliance, that there is a understanding of how everyone can interact with each other, and each planet does have their own planet-based politics, right? It's very similar to how America is, in the sense that, or how America should be, in the sense that there's a federal government and then there's local governors, right? So every planet has their own local governance and their own ability to act out and have their own reprimanding of different situations. But there's an overall understanding of how everyone should interact with each other. And I think without that, you couldn't have a society that endured for this period of time. It would collapse before that.
So, talking about hypothetical societies brings us to another couple of good questions. I'm gonna combo these ones as well. Gary asks, do you think there's intelligent life other than that on Earth? And John asks, have your own beliefs regarding alien life influenced your writing?
So the second part, 100%. I think my own beliefs of everything influences my writing. I would say any good author pulls from life experiences and pulls from their own beliefs to create a narrative that is true to them, but also true to the project that they're working on. In terms of, do I believe there's alien life? I mean, simply put, there's about 400 or 500 billion galaxies last time I looked. It might even be more now. And each galaxy has about 100 to 200 billion stars, each with their own solar system. So we took a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that number. There's still millions of planets in the universe with intelligent life. So while we don't have proof, and while I don't like speculating in terms of what there is, the probability based solely on the math is pretty convincing that there is. And of course, there's tons of science that shows, the Drake equation and how a lot of those planets or a lot of those star systems have no planets in the habitable zone, and that removes a ton of them. And then some of them don't have this key element, and so on and so forth. And then the number of actual potential habitable planets becomes much smaller, and then the equation gets a little bit tighter. But even with all of those variables considered, the universe and the galaxies are just so vast that it is very hard for me to think that we are alone. Are we alone intelligent life? That's a different question. Are we alone in terms of life of any sort whatsoever? Most likely not.
Playing the probability game is always a little difficult, let alone spooky, Like, it always leaves you with more questions than answers.
Totally.
So we got a few more questions from folks who sent us some questions in advance. One of them is, so I'm going to kind of make a mashup of these because I think they all lead to a slightly more interesting, you're seeing a theme here, slightly more interesting question combined. So how do you exercise your world building process rather than your character writing process? Like, what is the difference between writing character development and writing world building? This is sort of a question from Isabella, but I've twisted it a little. And Christina will add on top of that, what intrigues you about a narrative that focuses on survival and survivors? So these are kind of twinned questions, I think.
So I would say, when we're building different worlds and stories in heavy metal, something that David and I always go back and forth on is the importance of the character development versus the importance of the environment. And it's one of the most it's such a healthy debate that we have with each other. And over the last few years, as we've worked together, I've realized you can't have a great environment unless if you have a great character that lives in that environment. So, my personal process is I create the environment first. I want to create a world and a place that is interesting to me. And then I'll place characters in that environment and create their history and their lore based on the environmental factors that we've created. So while the character and the world are developed separately, in my opinion, they have to be developed in tandem at some point in the creative process. And each of them are equally as important as the other. If you look at a scale of 100, each of them are 50%. So if you nail one of them but fail at the other, you're still going to be below a C in your total, creation. So both of those, auspices need to be at a level that is excellent, so that you have an excellent story with excellent characters that you care about, living in an excellent world that matters. There was a second part of that question that, Survivor.
I got you. Yeah. So the question was from Christina, which is, what intrigues you about narratives that focus on survival and survivors?
I think it's the age-old question of, fight or flight, right? We as intelligent, self-aware species find it interesting. Yeah, maybe we are self-aware. I saw that.
I was thinking more maybe we're intelligent, but I appreciate you giving us some benefit of the doubt.
I am an eternal optimist at the end of the day. But
that makes one of us.
I think people find it really interesting to get into a character that they care about, and then that character is put into an impossible situation. As a fellow Trekkie, they get put into Kobayashi Maru's, right?
Absolutely.
Yep. And when you put a character that you really care about in one of those situations, and then you see how that character acts, it gives you some of that original point that I was making, perspective as to how maybe we should act, right? Going back to Kirk and the episode, when you put a character that you see yourself in and you put him into a position that you've never been in, and then you see how that character reacts to that position, it makes you think about how you would react. And all of those factors, I think, become intriguing for a reader, a watcher, if it's a show or a movie, listening, if you're listening to the audiobook version, and all of these, factors kind of come together, and, together you think, well, how would I react in this situation? And that's why I think those sort of, precipice points are important, because it makes you think about yourself more than it makes you think about anything else.
So this is a great segue to, we're Publishers Weekly, not Entertainment Weekly. So that I have to ask you some kind of, publishing process related question. And that actually is a nice tie-in to what I think a good last question for this probably is, and we are rounding out toward the end here, which is, you are putting out the first book in a 10-book series in the middle of a pandemic. How has that process been for you, and what are your hopes for the remainder of it?
So it's been really interesting, because I love talking. I love, sharing the vision of the book. And I planned a whole in-person book tour last year for this book that is now a lot of Zooms and, adjusting. Exactly. and adjusting to that has been, interesting. But, from the publishing of this book, we were able to bring on great partners on the audiobook side with Podium Audio, and on the ebook side with Aethon Books. And these two guys have helped the load a lot, because, it's as you said, it's a weird, different time. So the more smart people that you can bring together to solve these problems, it's like, I'm going to get real nerdy here. It's like Mark Watney in The Martian. At the end of the movie, or at the end of the book, he says that there's a million problems, but you have to start with one and just solve that and move on, right? And that's how I felt this whole process was. There's going to be a ton of problems, a ton of things that have never happened before. So let's get partners and people in place in each of the different verticals that a book gets delivered in, have really smart people who have really great ideas, figure out the solutions to these problems that we've never seen before. And I think we've done a pretty great job. I mean, the book is in Barnes & Nobles, it's in Audible, it's on Amazon. It was an Amazon #1 bestseller in hard science fiction on opening week. So, I think we've solved a lot of those problems during the publishing process. But to your point, it was extraordinarily atypical from how I was expecting it to go if you had talked to me this time last year.
Well, you know what? Your book's in Barnes & Nobles now, and soon enough, it'll be in ebook form on the Kuiper Belt, which this time I pronounced right. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for this wonderful chat. Again, that was Matt Medney with Beyond Kuiper, which this time I'm pronouncing right, the Galactic Star Alliance. This is the first in a book of 10 published by Heavy Metal Magazine, which you can kind of see over here. Thank you all for tuning in. The last part of my process here is to tell you that the next Books on Tap live event is next Wednesday, December 9th. YA author June Her will be discussing her new historical mystery, The Forest of Stolen Girls. Sign up to receive a reminder of the event at publishersweekly.com/booksontap live. Hope you can join us then. Until then, thank you and keep reading.